They called it a once-in-a-lifetime flood, a sudden rupture high in the mountain, where ice cracked like thunder and ancient water surged down without warning. It swallowed roads, swept through pine forests, and tore fences from the ground like threads. The village below had only minutes to evacuate. Houses were washed clean of their memories. Fields vanished under gray waves. And then, just as violently as it arrived, the flood retreated, leaving behind a silence far louder than the storm itself. For days, the rescue teams combed through what was left. Men with helmets and orange vests sifted through mud and broken beams. Volunteers shoveled sludge from living rooms. Roads reopened, electricity returned, and slowly, the valley tried to forget. But water always leaves a trace. And sometimes, what it uncovers was never meant to be found. It was the 5th morning after the flood, when 3 municipal workers were clearing debris from a culvert near the far end of the lake. The water there had risen, and then dropped again, creating a thick swamp of tangled weeds, broken branches, and rusted trash. They worked in silence, dragging driftwood into piles and cutting through twisted fencing tangled in the mud. One of the Mermere was waist-deep in the water when his boot struck something hard. He bent down, reaching beneath the surface with gloved hands, expecting a tire or collapsed railing. But when his fingers closed around something cold and square, he paused. It wasn't a natural shape. It was rigid, constructed. As he tugged it free, the brown water frothed around the edges. Slowly, as the weight lifted into the air, he saw what it was. A cage, iron bars, rusted through, bent at the corners, covered in mud and rotted rope. For a moment, Amir froze, thinking it was empty, just another piece of junk dredged up by the flood. Then something inside it moved. He stumbled back with a cry, slipping in the muck. The others came running, grabbing the cage by its side and pulling it up onto the dry bank. It hit the ground with a wet thud, and then they saw it pressed against the back corner of the bars, barely breathing, soaked and shivering. A dog. Its fur was almost gone. Its ribs pushed against the skin like broken spokes. Blood oozed from wounds along its legs where the wires had cut deep. But worst of all were its eyes. They weren't wild. They weren't even afraid. They were empty, staring at the world as if it no longer belonged to it. The men didn't know what to do. One called for help. Another took off his jacket and covered the dog. Amir knelt down, whispering words he didn't even understand himself. Soft, panicked, human. The dog didn't move. When the emergency team arrived, they tried to lift the cage, but it was heavier than expected. Underneath the base, they found chains, long, thick ones, anchored in concrete. This cage had not been tossed here by accident. It had been placed, fixed, hidden. It hadn't floated in from the flood. The flood had uncovered it. The dog was rushed to the animal trauma unit, where surgeons fought to repair the damage. As they cleaned her, they found something lodged deep under her collar, a tag, sealed in dirt. It had one word engraved in it, double quotes, 20. Double quotes. No one knew what it meant, not yet. But when authorities drained the nearby basin 2 days later, they found another cage, and this one wasn't empty. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? It's always amazing to see our global community come together. They named her 20 because it was the only clue she carried. A rusted tag buried deep in her neck fur, wrapped so tightly it had to be cut free with trembling hands. The word wasn't etched like a name, it was stamped, machine-pressed, almost like an inventory number. The vet had held it in her palm for a long moment, staring at the faded metal as the dog lay motionless on the table. A tube in her nose, her limbs barely twitching beneath the heat lamp. Her condition was worse than they expected. Malnourished, infected wounds, possible fractures along the hip, and those eyes silent, resigned, not from fear, but from a kind of quiet understanding that no help had ever come before. And maybe wouldn't this time either. But someone did come. His name was Yusuf. He wasn't a rescuer by profession. He was a flood recovery volunteer and engineer, the kind of man who repaired roads and bridges, not broken animals. He had been there the day she was pulled from the mud, holding a clipboard, organizing drainage reports. When someone shouted from the ravine, he had been the one to kneel beside her, while others backed away. The one who wrapped her in his own flannel shirt and stayed with her through the night at the clinic, when they weren't sure she'd survive until morning. Yusuf didn't know why he stayed. Maybe it was the weight of what they'd already seen over the last week: families displaced, homes swallowed by sludge, livestock pulled from ditches. Or maybe it was something more personal. He had once lost his younger brother to a landslide, years ago, and hadn't been able to pull him free. There was something about this creature trapped beneath weight, silent in her suffering, that cracked open a wound he thought had long scarred over. He returned to the clinic the next day, and the next. Brought her food she couldn't eat, and books she couldn't understand, but read aloud anyway, softly, because the silence in the recovery room felt unbearable. The vet noticed. So did the nurse. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They just began calling her his dog. Even though no one had officially adopted her, she didn't move for 3 days. Then, on the 4th, when he arrived and sat beside her cot, she turned her head, just slightly, enough to prove she was still in there, somewhere. That small movement changed everything. Yusuf began asking questions. Where had the cage come from? Who anchored it? Was this a one-time act of cruelty, or something worse, something systematic? He filed a report with the local authorities, but paperwork vanished quickly in disaster zones. The police were overwhelmed with flood damage and displacement issues. A dog, even one found like that, was not a priority. But something about the way she had been trapped refused to let him sleep. The chains had been buried. The cage itself was too heavy to move without intention. And the number 20, what did that mean? He began digging through old inspection maps, drainage reports, and satellite scans from before and after the glacier breach. He noticed something strange. The area where she was found wasn't even supposed to be flooded. It sat higher than the overflow zone. That meant someone had placed the cage in that culvert before the glacier broke. The flood hadn't hidden the cage, it had revealed it. The deeper he dug, the stranger things became. In one report from last spring, he found a mention of a dead goat in a steel crate found downstream, but no follow-up. In another, a maintenance complaint listed animal noise near pipe system, but was marked resolved with no evidence. Yusuf felt the cold creep in as the pattern slowly emerged. There had been others, maybe not all dogs, maybe not all survived, but cages, numbers, something wasn't right. At the clinic, 20 began to change. She still didn't bark, still didn't eat unless Yusuf was nearby, but she was healing. Her fur began growing back in patches, her eyes softened at the corners, and one morning, when he reached out to change her water bowl, she licked his wrist. That tiny gesture was enough to make him cry for the first time in a decade. He knew now that she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was evidence. Someone had tried to erase her, to sink her into silence. And whatever reason they had, whatever sick motive it wasn't finished. Because that basin still had another cage inside it. 2 days after the floodwaters fully drained, a drone team captured an image of a second steel frame embedded deeper in the embankment. The authorities said it was just debris. A rescue team was never sent. No photos were taken up close. Yusuf couldn't stop thinking about it. He started sleeping at the clinic, just in a chair near her kennel. 20 would raise her head each night when the lights dimmed and lower it only when she heard the sound of his voice, softly murmuring something she couldn't possibly understand but still listened to. People began asking questions. Why was he still there? Why was a structural engineer chasing shadows about cages and dogs and floods? But Yusuf didn't care, because 20 was alive. and he had seen what the water had tried to keep hidden, and something told him there was more waiting below. The image from the drone wouldn't leave his mind. It sat lodged behind his eyes, like a thorn, invisible to everyone else, but impossible for him to ignore. The second cage, barely visible beneath the murky waterline, rested deeper within the culvert bend, just where the runoff current met the old maintenance trench. Most of the recovery crews had already packed up and gone. Officials marked the zone as cleared, but Yusuf couldn't shake the feeling that someone had left something behind, something that wasn't meant to be found. The memory of 20 lying half dead in that rusted frame, chains wrapped like a funeral shroud, kept pulling him back. It wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about knowing the truth, about understanding who had done this, and if they were still doing it. That night, as the rain returned in soft sheets against the clinic windows, Yusuf stood from his chair beside her kennel, pulled on his boots, and walked out into the storm without a word. He didn't take a team, no cameras, no drone, just a crowbar, a headlamp, and a rope. The basin had changed since the waters receded. Mud had hardened into thick patches that cracked under his feet. The silence was heavier than it had been days ago, and the air smelled of rust and roots, and something faintly metallic like old blood left too long in the rain. He reached the culvert mouth and crouched low, shining the beam into the narrow space. The metal bars at the entrance were twisted, like someone had bent them outward with force, and deep inside, just at the far curve, he saw it again. Not a trick of the light, not a rock, a cage, same shape, same size, same silence. The entrance was too tight to walk through upright, so he dropped to his knees, strapping the rope around his waist and gripping the crowbar with both hands. Each movement forward scraped his knees, smeared his hands in wet grit. The further in he crawled, the darker it became. Not the kind of dark that comes from absence of light, but the kind that feels alive, watching, pressing against the skin, like breath. Every sound became sharper, the echo of his breath, the splash of water around his elbows, the distant groan of shifting metal ahead, and then he reached it. The cage was half buried in the trench wall, wedged under collapsed concrete and twisted vines. It didn't move when he touched it. He ran his fingers along the bars, feeling the familiar corrosion. The same knots of industrial chain looped through its frame, pulled tight around a cement anchor. But this one was different. There was something inside, movement, a low, muffled gasp. He pressed his face closer, adjusting the headlamp until the beam hit the center of the cage, and there, in the back corner, shaking violently and soaked in filth, was another dog. This one younger, smaller, black-furred, snout twisted in a rope, gag so tight it had torn into the skin, eyes wide, terrified, alive, his chest locked. For a second, he couldn't breathe. Then instinct took over. He drove the crowbar against the lock, once, twice, until the rust cracked. The chain wouldn't break, but the hinge began to split. He worked faster, teeth gritted, the confined air choking him as debris from above started to slide. The cage groaned. A slab of concrete shifted. Water rushed in deeper, soaking his legs, but he didn't stop. One more strike and the door flung open with a screech. The dog didn't run, it collapsed. Yusuf grabbed the limp body, cradling it to his chest as the trench began to rumble. He turned, dragging himself backward, feet slipping, knees bleeding. Water rising up to his ribs. The space behind him narrowed, roots now blocking part of the path, but he forced his body through them, coughing, choking on soil and storm water. The dog didn't move, just breathed, faintly, against his shirt, just like 20 had. When he finally emerged into the open basin, gasping beneath the bruised sky, the rain had turned violent. Thunder cracked overhead. His legs gave out, but he didn't let go of the dog. Someone must have seen his flashlight, because, within minutes, headlights appeared at the basin's edge, voices shouting his name through the storm. A pair of hands pulled him up. Then another took the dog. Then came blankets, radios, an ambulance. But Yusuf's voice cut through it all. "There's more," he said hoarsely. "There were 2 cages." His words silenced the noise. Later, as he lay in the emergency room with stitches in his palms and lungs, recovering from mild fluid inhalation, someone from animal control came to ask questions. Then someone from law enforcement. Then a local journalist. Yusuf gave them everything. He knew the drone images, the coordinates, the pattern he'd started to track. But one detail stuck more than the rest. The dog in the second cage. Its collar was cleaner, newer dot, and the tag didn't say 20. It said 21. The vet confirmed she was barely a year old. No microchip, no history, just the same deliberate wounds. Same pattern of restraint. Same dead silence. But she had survived. Because Yusuf hadn't waited. Because he had chosen to go back. Even when no one else believed him. Back at the clinic, 20 lay in her kennel beside the newest arrival. The 2 dogs didn't interact. At first. One too old in pain, the other too new in fear. But that night, as the storm rolled over the valley again and Yusuf sat beside them with a fresh bandage across his hand, something happened. The younger dog shifted, curled closer to the bars that separated them, and 20, without lifting her head, reached one paw through and rested it against the new pup's shoulder. No bark, no whimper, just contact, as if to say, "You made it to Dot," and somewhere beyond that clinic, beneath deeper water, or hidden roots, or behind another false wall, a tag marked 22 might still be waiting. The new dog didn't have a name. Not yet. Not officially. In the clinic logbook, they labeled her 21 beside a timestamp and a question mark under breed. She was too thin for anyone to guess accurately. Her fur, once black and likely soft, was mottled, now stripped in places where infection had taken hold. Her eyes remained wide and silent, staring at every hand, every door, every shadow, as if they might snap shut around her again. But what unsettled the staff most wasn't her fear. It was the way she moved. Not startled, not panicked, but precise, like she had been taught to anticipate pain. She was young, no older than a year, maybe less. Her body bore injuries that had healed, incorrectly broken toe bones, dislocated shoulders, rope burns that wrapped around her abdomen like a belt. And then there were the markings, not scars, but deliberate signs. A branded circle beneath her ear, so faint it almost looked like a birthmark. But under blacklight, it glowed. A chemical tag, unusual, not for pets, for inventory. Yusuf sat beside her kennel night after night. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He simply stayed, watching over both 20 and the new one. 20 had grown stronger, her wounds scabbing, her tail twitching in sleep, her eyes no longer drifting into blankness. She seemed to understand that this second dog was one of her own. When food was placed between their kennels, she waited for the other to eat first. When the younger whimpered in dreams, 20 inched closer, lying beside the bars until her breathing settled again. Still, no one knew where they had come from, until the whisper reached him. It came from an older janitor at the clinic, quiet man, rarely spoken to. He pulled Yusuf aside one morning, glancing over his shoulder before speaking. "I know that mark," he said, pointing at the image of the chemical circle taken from 21's skin. "We used to see dogs like that, years ago. But no one ever said where they came from." He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, "There was a place. Not far. Used to be a dog training center for private security contractors, military retirees, wealthy clients. They trained everything: attack dogs, trackers, even search and rescue. But then it got shut down after a scandal. Whispers about abuse, about dogs disappearing." Yusuf's blood ran cold. He dug into records that afternoon, public reports, private complaints, satellite images. Eventually, he found it a fenced compound in the woods, about 45 minutes east of the flood basin. Officially abandoned 5 years ago, but a few satellite scans showed activity far more recent. Vehicles parked at odd intervals. One corner of the compound completely obscured from overhead view, covered in tarp or sheet metal, as if someone didn't want it seen. He printed every image, cross-referenced the tag numbers. The deeper he went, the sicker he felt. 20 wasn't just a number. She had been cataloged, filed, like property, according to one leak. The dogs at this facility were graded based on performance. Those who failed physical benchmarks were decommissioned, no adoption, no surrender, just removed, quietly, off the books. Yusuf stared at the document in his hands, dated 2 years ago, listing canines retired from live training. One entry reads simply, Dog ID 0020, excessive submission per. Non-reactive to command, removed from asset list. The initials D and R were written beside it. Do not rehome. He couldn't move. He looked over at 20 sleeping peacefully near the heater, her body curled small, her ears twitching slightly in dreams. A dog too gentle to fight, too soft to be aggressive, too useless for what she'd been created to do. They had buried her alive for being kind. The next name on the list. No notes, just a line break. She hadn't even been given a reason. Yusuf sat in his car that night, parked just outside the compound gates. They were still there, tall, rusting, padlocked. But behind them, he saw faint tire tracks. Fresh, a building, with lights still faintly flickering behind plastic-covered windows. It wasn't abandoned. Not fully. Somewhere behind that fence. Someone had continued the work, quietly, illegally, off-grid. He wanted to break in, wanted to storm the gates, find more cages, more survivors, bring them all out into the daylight. But he couldn't, not yet. He needed proof. And so, he returned to the clinic and sat down beside the 2 dogs. For hours, he watched them, 20's breathing slow, 21's still shallow, but less rigid. The bond between them had grown, not loud but solid, like stones placed side by side beneath rising water. Together, they didn't flinch as often. Together, they shared space. Healing not through words, but presence. In the morning, Yusuf returned to the records room and began scanning older documents. Somewhere, he found a note, scribbled by a long-gone volunteer, an offhand comment about an anonymous donor who had once provided canine disposal services for the training center. No contact number, just a name, M. Hanif. He took the note, took the satellite scans, took the photographs. Then he walked into the office of the local reporter who had written about the glacier burst. He placed everything on her desk, said, I need you to listen, and didn't stop speaking for an hour. By the end, she was pale, shaken, but her voice didn't tremble when she said, We're going to tell this story. That night, the first image went online. The cage, the chains, the number tags, the before and after photos of 20 and 21. A headline above it all, Trained to Obey, Left to Die. What the floodwaters revealed. The world began to watch. But Yusuf knew this wasn't the climax. It was the beginning, because the cages were just symptoms. The disease still lived behind those walls, and he wasn't finished. Not until every dog marked with a number finally had a name. The article went live on a quiet Tuesday evening. There were no press conferences, no breaking news segments, just one photograph. A dog with hollow eyes, wrapped in a towel, barely recognizable as a living being. Beside it, the rusted cage. Below, a caption that read, She was marked as number 20. She was never supposed to be found. It didn't take long before the post began to spread. Comments poured in. Donations. Messages of horror. People wanted justice. Demanded answers. But for Yusuf, none of it felt like victory. Not yet. Because behind all the outrage, behind all the shares and reposts, the compound still stood, quiet, untouched. The training facility had gone dark after the publication. No lights, no movement, but someone was still inside. He felt it, not just from instinct, but from the silence. It was too clean, too calculated. Someone had wiped it before it was ever exposed. For a week, no law enforcement arrived. The article had reached the public, but the chain of command had stalled. Too many departments. Too much bureaucracy. There were whispers that the land was privately leased through a holding firm. No direct names. No clear ownership. The local police couldn't act without cause. The federal offices were distant, uninterested. The urgency that burned in Yusuf's chest wasn't reflected in anyone else's eyes. It was like standing outside a burning building, screaming, while everyone else admired the smoke. So he made a decision. He wouldn't wait for the world to act. He would bring the evidence to them. 20 had healed enough to walk now. Not far. And not without rest. But she followed him from room to room. Her legs still trembled. Her tail stayed low, but she followed. 21, still recovering from her infections, had begun to respond to touch. She leaned slightly into his hand when he sat beside her. Their progress was quiet, invisible to most, but it was there, and it mattered. Because they weren't just survivors, they were witnesses. Every scar they carried, every gesture of fear, was a piece of the story no one could deny. Yusuf returned to the compound not with force, but with a camera. He scaled the back fence at dawn, heart racing with every step, unsure whether he'd find someone waiting on the other side. But the yard was empty. The building looked gutted, but he knew better. Places like this didn't disappear, they buried themselves deeper. Inside, the rooms had been stripped, mats removed, walls bleached, but in the back wing, where the foundation had cracked from flood damage, he found something they hadn't erased. A journal, leather-bound, water-damaged, shoved into a cabinet behind a broken pipe panel. Inside were handwritten logs, behavior notes, names of dogs, replaced with numbers. The dates matched the reports Yusuf had already collected. 20 was listed. So was 21. There were others up. 230-4. His hands trembled. 30-4. Only 2 had been found. He photographed every page, heart pounding as the weight of it all settled on his spine. This was no longer theory, no longer whispers. It was written, recorded. They had marked these animals like merchandise, evaluated them like machines, and discarded them when they didn't perform. He closed the book and turned to leave, but paused at the sound of something hollow metal knocking faintly against concrete. Following the sound, he moved through a narrow hallway, peeling back a sheet of hanging tarp. Behind it, a trap door. Locked. No handle, but newer bolts. He didn't try to open it. He didn't have to. Whatever lay beneath that floor was never meant to see the light again. He left quickly, not looking back, phone filled with images that would be impossible to explain away. When he returned to the clinic, the vet met him at the door, face drawn tight. The younger one, she said quietly. 21. She tried to crawl into 20's kennel. We let her. We didn't stop her. Yusuf walked in, finding the two of them curled together, 20's head resting protectively over the smaller one's neck. It was the first time either had touched another being without flinching. And Yusuf, standing there, covered in sweat and dust and the weight of all he'd seen, knew exactly what had changed. He wasn't just saving dogs anymore, he was becoming their voice. The next morning, he drove to the capital. He didn't schedule a meeting. He walked into the district office for animal welfare, dropped the journal, the photographs, the satellite scans on the counter, and said one sentence that silenced the entire floor. I have proof that their dogs were disposed of like garbage and only 2 are alive. He didn't wait for their questions. He simply left, because the story had turned. He wasn't begging for attention anymore. He was delivering a reckoning. That same week, he filed to adopt both dogs. He didn't care about the cost. He didn't ask if his apartment allowed pets. He signed the papers with hands still raw from that night in the trench. Their names would no longer be numbers. 20 became Noor. 21 became Asha.light.hope.hope. He knew, deep in his bones, that this wasn't just about these two. It was about the others, the ones not yet found, the ones still underground, and the one behind it all who had counted these lives like currency and buried them beneath chains and silence. He had made a mistake. He had led to survive, and now they were no longer evidence. They were witnesses, and Yusuf was no longer just a rescuer. He was coming for the truth. It didn't happen all at once. Justice never does. The district office didn't issue a press release. No headlines blared in bold red. But behind closed doors, investigations began to stir. The files Yusuf had delivered, the photographs, the journals, the map of the compound, and its sealed floor circulated quietly between departments. First in animal welfare, then law enforcement, then in the office of a retired prosecutor who had once been shamed for going after a private military contractor, and who, seeing the tags and numbers, knew exactly what kind of people hid behind fences and silence. Meanwhile, the clinic stayed quiet. Noor and Ushan, no longer 20 and 21s, spent their days in sunlight now. Noor had learned how to stand at the window and watch the street, tail gently wagging whenever she recognized Yusuf's car. Asha had stopped shrinking from sound, had started eating without supervision, and one morning, she climbed into Yusuf's lap without hesitation and fell asleep. No flinch, no testing, just trust, earned slowly, fought for. Yusuf took photos every week, not for social media, not for applause, but to document what healing looked like, what survival became, because he knew that when the case finally opened, when the names behind the cages were exposed, he would not show the world the broken bodies pulled from the mud. He would show them these moments: Noor, nudging open a door with her paw, Asha, licking peanut butter off his fingers. Tiny triumphs that looked like nothing, until you remembered where they came from. But the waiting came with weight. Weeks passed. Then one evening, just after sunset, a black SUV pulled up outside the clinic. Two men in suits stepped out, not aggressive, not armed, but serious. One introduced himself as Agent Selman from the Federal Wildlife Protection Authority. The other remained quiet but carried a brown file in his hand, thick and folded at the corners. Yusuf met them in the hallway, tense, unsure whether this was the beginning of pushback or progress. The man in silence handed over the file. Inside were scanned pages from a private security firm's internal correspondence contracts, email chains, and incident reports. Some of the pages had red stamps over them, confidential, do not release. Others had annotations written in pen, phrases like non-compliant asset, and dispose with protocol 3 inches circled in red. This came from a whistleblower, Agent Salman said softly. Someone who saw the article. They couldn't stay quiet anymore. The evidence was enough. Enough to request a warrant. Enough to crack open the shell of corporate silence. And most importantly, enough to open the trapdoor buried beneath the compound. It took 2 weeks to get inside. Yusuf wasn't allowed to enter, but he waited outside the gate the day the team went in, flanked by officials in body armor and 2 unmarked vans. The sound of grinding metal echoed from deep within, and when they emerged, the men didn't speak. Their faces were pale, hollow. One of them was crying. Inside the sealed basement, they found 7 more cages. 5 were empty, 2 were not. 1 dog was already gone, its body preserved in plastic. The other, still alive. Barely. She was covered in wounds, her breathing shallow, her eyes too weak to move, but she was alive. They rushed her out in a wrapped blanket, and when the medic asked if she had a name, Yusuf stepped forward. He looked down at her fragile frame, her ribs pressing through every inch of skin, her paws trembling even as she lay still. And then he whispered, "Her name is Saba." It meant patience, because she had waited longer than anyone should ever have to. The next day, the compound was sealed. Charges were filed, quietly, but they were real. Not just animal cruelty, but criminal conspiracy. Illegal disposal of government property. The language was clinical, detached, but behind every word was a living, breathing soul with a story to tell. Noor, Asha, Saba, and the unnamed ones who never made it out. Media began to pay attention again, but the headlines were different. Now, not just shock, but remembrance. People lit candles, posted artwork. Volunteers came forward, asking to foster, to help, to give back. The clinic that once stood half empty now had a waiting list, and in the center of it all stood Yusuf, no longer just an engineer, no longer just a rescuer, but something more permanent, a witness. One morning,